Arthur hadn't kept a meal down in 6 weeks. The expensive doctors blamed stomach ulcers. His paranoid underboss blamed slow-acting poison. Arthur knew it was just the smell of blood. It coated his throat day and night, turning prime rib to ash and vintage wine to battery acid. Then came Nora. She didn't serve him truffles or foam. She shoved a bowl of blistered tomatoes and burnt garlic pasta across his mahogany desk, smelling of cheap laundry soap and sweat. For the first time in years, Arthur salivated. The dining room was a tomb of imported marble and oppressive silence. At the head of a table long enough to seat 20, Arthur sat alone. He stared at the plate in front of him. Pan-sired duck breast, with a cherry demi-glace resting on a bed of parsnip puree. It looked like a painting. It smelled like a corpse. Arthur picked up his silver fork. The metal was heavy cold against his knuckles. He cut a small, precise piece of the meat, dragging it through the dark red sauce. The color reminded him too much of the carpet in the warehouse down by the docks 2 nights ago. He closed his eyes, swallowed the bile rising in his throat, and put the meat in his mouth. He chewed once, twice. The texture was horribly soft, yielding against his teeth like rotting fruit. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He grabbed the linen napkin, spat the duck into it, and dropped it onto the pristine plate. "Take it away," he rasped. From the shadows near the doorway, Dominic stepped forward. Dominic was built like a freight train, wearing a suit that cost more than a car, but his eyes were tight with the kind of worry he usually reserved for federal indictments. Dominic started his voice a low rumble. "You gotta eat. You look like a ghost wearing a bespoke suit. It's been days." I said, "Take it away." Arthur's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. The quiet rasp was enough to make the hired waiter, a kid who looked barely out of culinary school, scramble forward with shaking hands to clear the $300 meal. Arthur pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against marble echoed sharply. He stood his vision swimming for a fraction of a second. He gripped the edge of the table until the room steadied. Dominic was right. He was wasting away. The tailored wool of his trousers hung loose around his waist. His cheekbones jutted out like knives beneath his pale skin. It wasn't a disease, not a physical one at least. The doctors had run every scan, drawn vials of blood, shoved cameras down his throat. Stress, they concluded. Anxiety. They prescribed pills that made his mouth dry and his mind foggy. He stopped taking them. A boss with a foggy mind was a dead boss. The truth was simpler and much worse. Arthur's body was rejecting his life. Every time he smelled roasting meat, he smelled the iron tang of violence. Every time he tasted wine, he tasted the adrenaline and fear of the men who begged him for their lives. His palate had become a cursed thing, translating luxury into guilt, flavor into disgust. He was starving to death in a house that boasted a walk-in refrigerator the size of a studio apartment, stocked with caviar truffles and Wagyu beef. He walked past Dominic without another word, heading for his study. He needed a drink, though even the scotch tasted like smoke from a burning building lately. Down in the bowels of the estate, the kitchen was in chaos. Chef Pascal was throwing a tantrum, hurling a copper saucepan into the industrial sink. "Philistine!" Pascal shrieked. "He has no palate. He is a thug with a black card. I cannot work in these conditions." Nora ignored him. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the grout beneath the massive 6-burner Wolf range. The harsh chemical smell of bleach stung her nose, but it was better than the smell of Pascal's heavy, rich sauces, which had been making her nauseous since she clocked in at 5 a.m. Nora was not a chef. She was the newest maid, hired 3 days ago through an agency that specialized in discreet staff for high-net-worth individuals. It was code for turning a blind eye to the men with holstered guns pacing the perimeter. Nora didn't care about the guns. She cared about the $35 an hour, the double overtime, and the fact that she was exactly 4 paychecks away from keeping her brother's legs from being broken by a loan shark in South Boston. She scrubbed harder. The brush bristles snapped against the tile. "You," Pascal snapped, pointing a trembling, flour-dusted finger at her. "Clean up this duck. Throw it out. The boss is fasting again. A tragedy of culinary ignorance." Nora sat back on her heels, wiping a strand of dull brown hair out of her eyes with the back of a gloved hand. She looked at the plate the waiter had brought down. The duck was perfectly cooked. The vegetables were vibrant. "Waste of good food," she muttered, grabbing the plate. "What did you say?" Pascal demanded. "I said I'll take care of it." Nora lied, dumping the contents into the garbage disposal and flipping the switch. The loud grinding noise drowned out whatever French insult Pascal hurled at her next. She watched the expensive meal turn to mush and vanish. Her own stomach let out a hollow, aching growl. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, a stale bagel on the bus ride over. But she wouldn't eat Pascal's food. It looked too fussy. Too rich. It looked like the kind of food that made you weak. Nora stripped off her rubber gloves. Her shift was supposed to end in 20 minutes, just enough time to make something real before she had to catch the bus back to her damp, drafty apartment. The kitchen was empty. Pascal had stormed out, threatening to resign for the 3rd time that week. The other staff gave the kitchen a wide berth when the chef was on a rampage. Nora opened the massive stainless steel refrigerator. It was a monument to excess. Jars of imported preserves, slabs of marbled meat, delicate greens wrapped in damp cloth. It made her angry, this sheer volume of untouched sustenance, while her brother was eating instant ramen in the dark because they couldn't afford the electricity bill. She ignored the expensive cuts. She dug into the crisper drawer and found a handful of tomatoes that had gone slightly soft, past their prime for Pascal's salads, destined for the trash. She grabbed them, a head of garlic from a wire basket, a half-empty box of dried spaghetti sitting forgotten on a pantry shelf, likely meant for the staff meals. She didn't use the pristine copper pots. She found a heavy, scarred, cast-iron skillet shoved in the back of a lower cabinet. Nora turned on the flame. It roared to life, blue and violent. She didn't mince the garlic into tiny, perfect squares. She smashed the cloves with the flat of a knife, the wet crack echoing in the empty kitchen. She threw them into the skillet with a heavy glug of olive oil. She wanted the garlic to burn a little. Not a lot, just enough to catch the edge of the pan and turn golden brown, releasing a sharp, bitter, deeply savory smell. It was the smell of her grandmother's cramped kitchen in Queens. It was the smell of being poor, but being alive. When the edges of the garlic turned the color of an old penny, she threw in the tomatoes. They hit the hot oil with a vicious hiss, spitting fat onto her uniform. Nora didn't flinch. She pressed down on the tomatoes with a wooden spoon until their skins blistered and burst, releasing their acidic juice into the oil deglazing the dark bits of garlic from the iron. A pinch of cheap kosher salt. A heavy, aggressive grind of black pepper. The smell began to rise. It wasn't delicate. It didn't smell like a restaurant. It smelled like earth salt and fire. It was pungent, cutting through the lingering scent of bleach and expensive duck fat. 2 floors up, Arthur was staring at a spreadsheet he wasn't reading. The numbers blurred together. His stomach gave a sharp, painful cramp. He pressed his fist into his abdomen, leaning forward over his desk. The dull, throbbing pain of the ulcer was constant now. He closed his eyes and breathed in, trying to steady himself. Then he smelled it. It wasn't blood. It wasn't the metallic tang of fear. It wasn't the cloying, sweet stench of reduction sauces that made him want to vomit. It was sharp. It was aggressive. It smelled like dirt and heat. Arthur's eyes snapped open. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating. His mouth, dry as cotton for weeks, suddenly flooded with saliva. The physical reaction was so intense, so unexpected, that he actually choked on it, coughing into his hand. He stood up. His legs felt shaky, but the hollow ache in his stomach had suddenly morphed from a threat into a demand. He opened the heavy oak door of his study. Dominic was leaning against the wall in the hallway, scrolling on his phone. He looked up surprised. Arthur rarely left his office before midnight. "Boss, you need something." "What is that?" Arthur asked. His voice was hoarse. Dominic sniffed the air. He frowned. "Smells like garlic. Did Pascal come back?" "Pascal doesn't cook like that," Arthur said. "Pascal treated garlic like a volatile chemical, using it in microscopic refined quantities." This smell was unapologetic. It was practically screaming through the air vents. Arthur didn't wait for Dominic. He started walking. He didn't take the main staircase. He took the servants' stairs, his expensive leather shoes completely silent on the rubber treads. He followed the scent, like a starved hound, tracking blood in the snow. He pushed open the swinging doors to the kitchen. Nora was standing at the stove, her back to him. She was using a pair of metal tongs to drag dripping spaghetti directly from a pot of boiling water into the cast-iron skillet. The starchy pasta water hit the hot oil and tomatoes, hissing violently, emulsifying into a thick, glossy sauce. She tossed the pan with a flick of her wrist, the motion practiced and rough. Arthur stood frozen. He watched her shoulders move beneath the cheap, ill-fitting grey cotton of her uniform. There was a dark sweat stain between her shoulder blades. Her hair was falling out of a messy clip. She grabbed a chipped ceramic bowl from a drying rack staff, dishware, not the fine china. She dumped the pasta into it. It was a messy, unceremonious heap. She scraped the bottom of the skillet, making sure every burnt piece of garlic and blistered tomato skin made it into the bowl. Arthur took a step forward. "Give me that." Nora spun around, dropping the wooden spoon with a clatter. Her eyes went wide for a fraction of a second before narrowing into a hard, defensive glare. She recognized him. You didn't work in this house without memorizing the face of the man who paid your salary and who could end your life. But her grip on the bowl tightened. "Excuse me," Nora said. Her voice wasn't a soft, subservient murmur. It was flat, carrying the gravel of a queen's accent. "I said," Arthur repeated, taking another step closer. He could feel the heat radiating from the bowl. He could smell the acid of the tomatoes. His stomach gave a violent, desperate rumble, loud enough to be heard in the quiet kitchen. "Give me that." Nora looked at the bowl, then up at Arthur. She took in his pale, sunken face, the dark bags under his eyes, the suit that draped on him like a shroud. She didn't see a terrifying Mafia boss. She saw a starving man. "This isn't for you," she said, her tone stubbornly practical. "It's leftovers. Garbage, basically. Pascal would have a stroke." "Pascal isn't here," Arthur said. He closed the distance between them. He didn't reach out to take it from her. He just stood there, looking down at the messy pile of food. "Put it on the counter." Nora hesitated. Every survival instinct she had honed growing up in a bad neighborhood told her not to argue with the dangerous man in the $1,000 suit. But she was hungry. She had made this for herself. She set the bowl down on the stainless steel prep counter with a dull thud. She slid a standard water-spotted metal fork next to it. No polished silver, no linen napkin. Arthur looked at it. There was no garnish. No pristine white edges of a plate. Just red-orange, and the dark brown specks of garlic tangled in starch. He picked up the fork. His hand was trembling slightly. He hated that she could see it. He hated the vulnerability of his own failing body. Nora crossed her arms over her chest, stepping back. She expected him to take one bite gag and fire her for serving him peasant food. She watched his face, looking for the inevitable disgust. Arthur twirled the pasta around the fork. It wasn't elegant. He lifted it to his mouth. He closed his eyes. The heat hit his tongue, first followed instantly by the sharp, bright acid of the tomatoes. Then came the deep, earthy bitterness of the burnt garlic, cutting through the richness of the olive oil. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't refined. It had texture, the tough skins of the tomatoes, the slight chew of the pasta, the crunch of the garlic. He waited for his throat to close. He waited for the phantom taste of ash and copper to ruin it. He waited for his stomach to twist and reject it. Nothing happened. There was only the loud, visceral reality of the food. It grounded him. It didn't taste like his life. It tasted like survival. It tasted like someone else's desperate need to just eat and keep moving. Arthur swallowed. It went down smooth, sitting warm and heavy in his empty stomach. A strange, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound so raw and pathetic he would have killed any of his men for hearing it. He opened his eyes. He didn't look at Nora. He looked blindly at the tiled wall behind the stove, and he took another bite. Then another. The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the scrape of metal against ceramic, and the wet, frantic sounds of a man eating, as if he hadn't seen food in a decade. He abandoned all etiquette. He leaned over the counter, shoveling the pasta into his mouth, grease shining on his lips. He didn't chew thoroughly. He just consumed. Nora watched her initial annoyance melting into a profound, uncomfortable shock. She had seen junkies eat like this after a bender. She had never seen a man who owned half the city eat like a feral dog. A drop of tomato oil fell, staining the lapel of his grey suit. He didn't notice. He scraped the bottom of the bowl, hunting for the last slivers of garlic, the metal fork screeching against the ceramic. When the bowl was empty, Arthur set the fork down. He gripped the edge of the metal counter with both hands, his head bowed, breathing heavily through his nose. His knuckles were white. Nora didn't move. The air between them was incredibly thick, charged with a strange, ugly intimacy. She had just witnessed something deeply private. A fracture in his armor. Arthur finally turned his head to look at her. There was color in his cheeks now. The dead, flat look in his eyes had been replaced by something sharp and alert. "What's your name?" he asked. The hoarseness was gone from his voice. It was deep authoritative, but grounded. "Nora," she said, keeping her chin up. Nora Hayes. Arthur stared at her. He took in the cheap uniform, the defensive posture, the calloused hands that had smashed the garlic. She smelled like bleach and hot oil. There was nothing soft about her. Nothing gentle. "You're not a chef," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm a cleaner," Nora replied flatly. "I clean the floors. I was just off the clock, making my lunch." Arthur looked back at the empty bowl. His stomach didn't hurt. For the first time in 6 weeks, the gnawing anxiety in his gut was quiet. The food sat there like an anchor, holding him down to the earth, stopping him from drifting away into the smoke and blood of his own mind. He pulled a crisp white linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth, erasing the grease. He stood up straight, smoothing his ruined lapel. He was the boss again. But the shift in power in the room was palpable, and they both felt it. "Pascal is fired," Arthur said quietly. Nora frowned. "He's going to have a fit. And who's going to cook for you? The agency doesn't send replacements for a week." Arthur stepped away from the counter, walking toward the swinging doors. He paused, turning back to look at her over his shoulder. The look in his eyes was calculating, stripped of its former exhaustion. It was a terrifying look. "You are," Arthur said. "I told you I'm a cleaner." Nora shot back, her pulse spiking. "I don't know how to make demi-glace or foam or whatever the hell you people eat. I made you scrap pasta because I was starving." "Good," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a register that sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't want foam. I want scrap pasta. You cook for me, every meal. I have a contract. I clean. I'll triple your hourly rate." Nora's mouth clicked shut. 3 times her rate. That would pay off her brother's debt in a month. It would get them out of the damp apartment. She swallowed hard, her practical mind warring with her instinct to run far away from this intense, broken man. 5 times, Nora blurted out before she could stop herself. "And I don't wear a uniform while I do it. Polyester makes me sweat." Arthur stared at her for a long, quiet moment. A very slow, dark smirk ghosted across his lips. It was a rusty expression, like a muscle he hadn't used in years. 5 times, Arthur agreed. "Be back here at 7 for dinner." He pushed through the swinging doors, leaving Nora alone in the kitchen with a dirty cast-iron pan and an empty bowl. She stared at the spot where he had stood. She had just extorted a Mafia boss, and worse, she had to figure out what to cook him next. 7 o'clock arrived with the heavy, oppressive silence that always settled over the estate when the sun went down. Nora stood in the center of the cavernous kitchen. She was no longer wearing the grey polyester uniform. She wore faded blue jeans and an oversized black wool sweater that had belonged to her father. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old rain, a scent she had tried to wash out twice. She stared down at the butcher block. On it sat a massive 3-pound slab of beef chuck. It was a tough, unyielding cut of meat riddled with connective tissue. The kind of meat you bought when you needed to feed 4 people on $10. Next to it sat a mesh bag of yellow onions, their papery skins shedding onto the clean wood, and 2 tall cans of cheap domestic lager she had demanded Dominic buy from the corner bodega. Dominic had looked at the beer cans like they were radioactive, but he had handed them over. Nora grabbed a heavy steel cleaver. She didn't bother trimming the fat. She hacked the beef into large, uneven chunks. The blade hit the board with a rhythmic, violent thwack. She threw the meat into a bowl, tossing it with a handful of coarse flour salt and enough black pepper to make her sneeze. The cast-iron skillet was smoking hot. She dumped the meat in. It seared instantly, a loud, aggressive sizzle filling the room. The smell of browning animal fat and scorched flour hit the air. It was a heavy working-class smell. It was the scent of a long shift at a factory of radiators hissing in winter. She roughly chopped 3 onions, not caring if the pieces were uniform. Tears pricked her eyes from the sharp, stinging sulfur. When the meat was crusty and dark brown on all sides, she threw the onions straight into the pan. They hissed and spit, soaking up the rendered beef fat. The kitchen doors swung open. Dominic walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks, his broad nose wrinkling. "Jesus Christ," Dominic muttered. "It smells like a dive bar in here. What are you doing?" "Cooking." Nora set her back to him. She cracked the pop tab on the first can of lager. It gave a sharp fizz. She poured the cheap beer directly into the hot pan. The alcohol hit the heat and exploded into a thick, yeasty steam that smelled sharply of hops and burnt sugar. She scraped the bottom of the pan with a wooden spoon, loosening the dark, crusted bits of meat and flour. "Arthur eats Wagyu," Dominic said, stepping closer. His tone was a warning. "He eats food flown in from Japan, not whatever the hell that is. You're going to make him sick." "Your chef's fancy food is what made him sick?" Nora shot back, dumping the whole mixture into a deep Dutch oven. "He wants this? If he fires me, fine. But this is what he gets." She shoved the heavy pot into the oven, slamming the door shut with a solid clank. "You got a lot of nerve for a girl who was scrubbing baseboards this morning," Dominic noted. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, crossing his arms. His suit jacket fell open just enough to reveal the leather shoulder holster strapped across his chest. Nora looked at the gun. She didn't blink. Growing up where she did, guns weren't a shock. They were a hazard like black ice or a stray dog. "I got a brother who needs rent money," Nora said flatly. "I don't have time to have nerve. I have a job. Tell your boss dinner is in 2 hours. The meat has to break down." 2 hours later, Arthur sat at the massive dining table. The pristine white tablecloth had been removed, leaving the bare, dark mahogany wood. Nora had insisted. She said the linen made her nervous. She walked into the dining room carrying a thick ceramic bowl with 2 hands. She didn't use a serving cart. She set it down in front of him. It was a dark, muddy brown stew. Thick, viscous gravy clung to jagged pieces of beef that had cooked down to absolute submission. Large, translucent chunks of onion floated in the sauce. Beside the bowl was a plate of rough mashed potatoes she had left the skins on, full of lumps, drowning in a pool of melted salted butter. Arthur stared at it. There was no color contrast. It wasn't beautiful. It looked like mud. He leaned forward, inhaling. The smell hit him like a physical blow. The sharp, alcoholic tang of the reduced beer. The deep, caramelized sweetness of the onions. The heavy, iron-rich scent of the beef. It bypassed his brain entirely and went straight to his gut. The phantom scent of blood that had haunted him all day vanished completely obliterated by the sheer, unapologetic pungency of the stew. He picked up his spoon. He didn't look at Nora, who stood awkwardly near the wall, her arms crossed over her oversized sweater. He took a bite. The beef fell apart against his tongue. The gravy was rich, sticky with collagen, coating the roof of his mouth. The potatoes were heavy and starchy, cutting through the intense savoriness of the meat. It wasn't delicate. It was the kind of food that demanded to be eaten in the cold by a fire by a man who had worked with his hands all day. Arthur closed his eyes. The tension in his jaw, tight as a coiled spring since he woke up, finally snapped. He let out a long, ragged exhale through his nose. He ate the entire bowl. He ate the potatoes. He used a piece of crusty bread to wipe the bowl clean, leaving streaks of white ceramic shining through the brown gravy. When he finally sat back, the silence in the room was heavy, but it was no longer a tomb. It was just quiet. "You left the skins on the potatoes," Arthur said, his voice a low gravel. It was the first thing he had said to her all evening. "Peeling them is a waste of time," Nora said defensively. "The skin has flavor. It adds texture. If you don't like it—" "I didn't say I didn't like it," Arthur interrupted. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the defensive jut of her chin. He saw a survivor. "Tomorrow," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Breakfast at 6. It was 3 in the morning. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. Nora was awake. She was sitting at the massive kitchen island, a mug of instant coffee growing cold between her hands. She couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was too loud, and the knowledge of what the men who lived here actually did for a living was beginning to weigh heavily on her chest. She heard the heavy oak front door open and close, muffled voices in the foyer, Dominic's low, urgent rumble, Arthur's sharp, clipped responses. A few minutes later, the kitchen doors swung open. Arthur walked in. He looked terrible. His suit jacket was missing. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the silk tie hanging loose. His hair, usually combed back with absolute precision, was messy falling over his forehead. but it was his hands that made Nora freeze. His right hand was trembling slightly. The knuckles were split red and raw, swelling violently against the pale skin. There was a dark, rusty smear across the cuff of his white shirt. Blood. The smell rolled off him in waves, not the metallic tang of an accidental cut, but the heavy coppery stench of violence. The cold night air clinging to his clothes couldn't mask it. It smelled like terror and raw meat. Arthur stopped when he saw her. He looked at his own hand, then quickly shoved it into his pocket, his jaw clenching so hard Nora thought his teeth might crack. The panic was back in his eyes, the wide, hollow look of a man drowning in his own mind. He took a step backward toward the door, his breathing turning shallow and fast. The nausea was rising in him again. She could see it in the pale cast of his face. Nora didn't gasp. She didn't ask what happened. She grew up with men who came home with busted knuckles and secrets. You didn't ask. You just dealt with the aftermath. She stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the tile. The noise snapped Arthur's attention back to her. "Sit down," Nora said. Her voice was flat, devoid of pity or fear. Arthur hesitated, staring at her like a cornered animal. "I said sit down," she repeated, turning her back to him. She walked over to the stove. "Before you pass out on my clean floor." She heard the slow, heavy drag of his footsteps, followed by the squeak of a leather bar stool. He sat at the island, his head bowed, his uninjured hand gripping the marble countertop like a lifeline. Nora turned on the flame under a flat steel griddle. She didn't go to the fridge for duck or caviar. She grabbed half a loaf of dense, sour rye bread she had bought at a Polish bakery that afternoon. She sliced 2 pieces, thick as paving stones. She dropped a heavy knob of salted butter onto the hot steel. It melted instantly, bubbling and spitting, turning a nutty, foamy brown. She threw the bread down. It sizzled violently, soaking up the fat. Next to the bread she cracked 2 eggs. The oil snapped against the egg whites, frying the edges instantly, making them curl and turn dark, crispy brown. The smell of the burning butter and frying eggs rapidly filled the kitchen. It was harsh, fatty, and utterly overpowering. It pushed the cold, metallic smell of blood out of the air, suffocating it, beneath a blanket of diner grease and toasted rye. Nora flipped the eggs, letting the yolks set just enough so they wouldn't run, then slid them onto the toasted bread. She grabbed a bottle of cheap vinegar-heavy hot sauce from her own stash in the pantry and dashed it aggressively over the top. The acid hit the hot eggs, releasing a sharp, stinging vapor. She slid the plate across the marble island. It stopped inches from Arthur's hand. Next to the plate, she set down a mug of black coffee. Not espresso, drip coffee. Bitter, dark, and scalding hot. "Eat," she commanded, grabbing a rag to wipe down the stove. Arthur slowly lifted his head. He looked at the plate. The edges of the eggs were jagged and burnt. The hot sauce bled into the butter-soaked bread. It was a violent-looking meal. He breathed in. The sharp vinegar and burnt butter invaded his sinuses. The cloying, sickening smell of iron was gone. He pulled his right hand out of his pocket. His knuckles throbbed stiff and painful. He awkwardly picked up the heavy sandwich with both hands, ignoring the pain. He took a bite. The crunch of the fried egg and the toasted rye echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. The harsh acid of the hot sauce cut through the heavy butter, shocking his palate. It was rough. It was loud food. It demanded his attention, forcing him out of his own head and into the physical sensation of chewing, swallowing, burning his tongue on the hot coffee. Nora scrubbed the pristine steel counter, keeping her eyes on her work. She didn't watch him eat. She gave him the dignity of ignoring his fracture. When the plate was empty, Arthur sat back. The violent trembling in his hands had stopped. The color had returned to his face, cutting through the ghostly pallor. You shouldn't be awake, Arthur said. His voice was ragged, exhausted but steady. I'm on 5 times my normal rate, Nora replied without turning around. I'm awake when I need to be. Arthur looked down at his bruised knuckles. The pain was sharp, but it was just pain. The sickening guilt, the ash in his mouth, it was gone, grounded into dust by the harsh, biting flavor of vinegar and burnt butter. Thank you, he said. The words were quiet, almost entirely swallowed by the vast kitchen. Nora stopped wiping the counter. She wrung out the rag, her hands tight. Don't thank me. Just wash your hands before you eat next time. You'll get grease on the marble. A short, dry sound escaped Arthur's throat. It took Nora a second to realize it was a laugh. 2 weeks later, the sanctuary of the house was breached. Dominic was pacing the kitchen, running his hands over his bald head. His anxiety was practically radiating off him, smelling like cheap cologne and stale sweat. They're not just captains. Nora, Dominic said, gesturing wildly toward the dining room doors. It's Carmine. It's Leo. These guys practically run the ports. When Arthur hosts a sit-down, they expect to be treated like kings. Pascal used to make a 5-course tasting menu. Venison, white truffles. You can't serve them diner food. Nora was standing over the stove, unfazed. She was wearing a white apron over a faded band t-shirt. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot. I don't know how to cook venison, Nora said, violently stirring a massive pot of deep red sauce. The smell of crushed tomatoes, sweet fennel seed and roasted garlic was thick enough to chew. And I don't care who they are. They're men. Men get hungry. They'll eat what I make. Arthur is finally getting his strength back, Dominic pleaded. He looks alive again. If you embarrass him in front of Carmine, Carmine will smell blood in the water. He'll think Arthur has gone soft. You don't understand these people. I understand people, Nora said, turning off the flame. She grabbed a heavy, deep ceramic baking dish. Grab that bowl of mozzarella, the big one. Dominic sighed a sound of utter defeat and handed her a massive stainless steel bowl filled with pounds of shredded low-moisture mozzarella cheese. Nora began layering. A thick coat of the rich, oily red sauce at the bottom. A mountain of perfectly al dente rigatoni. Slices of spicy Italian sausage, the casings charred black in the pan. Then she buried it all in a snowfall of mozzarella and sharp pecorino. She repeated the process until the dish was overflowing. She shoved it into the oven, cranking the heat up to 450 degrees. 40 minutes, Nora said, wiping her hands on her apron. Get them some drinks. In the dining room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars and the sharp tension of men who didn't trust each other. Carmine, a heavy-set man with a face like a bulldog and a suit that strained at the buttons, tapped his thick fingers on the mahogany table. So Arthur, Carmine, said, a sneer playing on his lips. I hear you've been sick, pacing the halls, losing weight. You look thin. It was an insult masked as concern. In their world, thin meant weak. Weak meant dead. Arthur sat at the head of the table. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling 2 fingers of scotch in a crystal glass. He wasn't shaking. His eyes were cold, dark, and utterly focused. I'm perfectly healthy, Carmine, Arthur said smoothly. Just cleaning house, getting rid of dead weight. He held Carmine's gaze until the older man looked away, coughing uncomfortably into his fist. Leo, a younger, sharper captain with slicked back hair, cleared his throat. Well, I hope your chef hasn't lost his touch. I skipped lunch for this. Pascal's duck liver pâté is the only reason I come to these meetings. Arthur took a sip of his scotch. It didn't taste like battery acid anymore. It tasted like peat and smoke. Pascal is no longer with me. Carmine raised an eyebrow. No, who's cooking then? The dining room doors swung open. There was no cart. There was no line of waiters in white gloves. Nora walked in. She was carrying the massive ceramic dish with 2 thick oven mitts. The dish was practically weaponized with heat. The edges of the cheese had bubbled over and burnt onto the ceramic, creating a crust of dark, crispy fat. The sauce was literally boiling, popping thick red bubbles that released columns of steam, smelling of garlic fat and hot starch. She walked straight to the center of the table and dropped the heavy dish onto a thick wooden trivet with a loud thud. She set down a stack of plain white plates and a large metal serving spoon next to it. "Watch your arms," Nora said bluntly. "The ceramic will take your skin off." She didn't offer to serve them. She turned on her heel and walked out the doors, swinging shut behind her. Dead silence descended on the dining room. Carmine stared at the bubbling mass of cheese and pasta. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. He looked at Arthur. "What the hell is this?" Carmine demanded, his voice thick with outrage. "Baked ziti. You're serving me baked ziti at a sit-down. Is this a joke, Arthur?" "Are we at a church? Basement? Potluck?" Leo sneered, pushing his chair back slightly. "It looks like slop. I'm not eating peasant food." Arthur didn't move. He looked at the bubbling pasta. The edges where the cheese had burned black, the rich oil separating from the sauce and pooling in the corners. His mouth began to water. He set his Scotch glass down. The clink of crystal on wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Arthur leaned forward. The relaxed posture vanished, replaced by a coiled, terrifying intensity. The aura of the ruthless, violent man who had taken the city by force snapped back into place. He looked at Carmine. His eyes were dead black pits. "You're going to eat it," Arthur said. His voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Carmine's outrage faltered, replaced by a sudden, chilling spike of fear. He swallowed hard. "You're going to pick up that spoon." Arthur continued his gaze, shifting slowly to Leo, freezing the younger man in his seat. "You're going to serve yourself, and you are going to enjoy it." No one breathed. The only sound in the room was the violent hissing of the hot fat in the baking dish. Arthur slowly reached out, picked up a white plate, and slid it toward Carmine. "Eat, Carmine. It's family style." Carmine's hands were shaking slightly as he picked up the heavy metal spoon. He dug into the pasta. The cheese stretched in thick, gooey strings. He dropped a massive portion onto his plate, the hot sauce splashing onto the pristine mahogany. He didn't care. He picked up his fork and took a bite, burning his tongue in his haste. He chewed. His eyes widened. It wasn't elegant, but it was spectacular. The heavy salt of the pecorino, the sweet spice of the fennel sausage, the perfect resistant chew of the pasta. It tasted exactly like Sunday dinner at his grandmother's house in Brooklyn 50 years ago, before the money, the blood, and the paranoia. Leo served himself next in terrified silence. He took a bite, and the sneer melted entirely off his face, replaced by a look of stunned, greedy focus. Within 5 minutes, the silence in the room was broken only by the scrape of silverware against plates and the heavy, animalistic sounds of men eating rapidly. The tension broke. They weren't mob bosses anymore. They were just hungry men, stripped of their pretenses, anchored to the table by the sheer weight of the food. Arthur finally took a plate for himself. He scooped up the burnt edges of the cheese, his favorite part. He ate slowly, savoring the heavy, grounding flavors. He looked toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. A faint, dark smile touched his lips. Carmine and Leo thought they were the most dangerous men in the room. They were wrong. The girl with the burnt garlic and the heavy hand with salt had brought them all to their knees. And she belonged to him. The truce lasted exactly 12 days. In Arthur's world, 12 days of silence was either a blessing or the fuse burning down on a bomb. It was 2 a.m. and the estate was locked down tight. Outside, a freezing rain turned the driveway into a sheet of black ice. Inside the massive kitchen was a haven of humid, butter-scented heat. Nora was baking. She didn't bake well. She lacked the patience for precise measurements and the delicate touch required for pastry. But she needed the physical exertion. Her brother Tommy had called earlier, his voice trembling, as he told her the loan shark had accepted the cash, but tacked on an exorbitant, late fee. The math meant she was stuck in this house cooking for monsters for at least another 6 months. She slammed a fist of cold butter into a mound of flour on the butcher block. She rubbed the fat and flour between her fingers, her hands moving with angry, jerky motions. She wasn't making anything delicate. It was a rustic apple galette, the kind of thing that didn't matter if it looked ugly, as long as it tasted like sugar and fire. She peeled Granny Smith apples with a paring knife, slicing them thick and uneven. She tossed them in a bowl with a reckless handful of dark brown sugar, a heavy pour of bourbon she'd stolen from the study, and enough cinnamon to make her eyes water. She didn't hear Arthur come in. His footsteps were non-existent. "You're murdering that dough." Nora jumped, the paring knife clattering against the wood. Arthur was standing near the doorway. He was wearing dark grey sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. It was the first time she had seen him out of a tailored suit. The casual clothes made him look younger, but they also exposed the hard, jagged lines of old scars tracking up his left forearm. He didn't look terrifying tonight. He looked exhausted. "Dough is supposed to be worked," Nora said, turning back to the butcher block. She grabbed a heavy wooden rolling pin and flattened the shaggy, butter-streaked mess. "Why are you awake? Why are you?" Arthur countered. He walked over to the island, pulling out a bar stool. He sat leaning his elbows on the cold marble, watching her hands. "My brother," Nora muttered, folding the jagged edges of the dough over the piled apples. "He's an idiot, and idiots are expensive." Arthur watched her brush the rough pastry with an egg wash, her movements quick and completely devoid of grace. "How much does he owe?" Nora stopped. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. Don't do that." "Do what?" "Play the benevolent boss. We have a contract. I cook your meals, you pay me an absurd amount of money, and I buy my family's way out of a hole. You don't ask about my life, and I pretend I don't know what you do when you leave this house." Arthur's face remained impassive, but his eyes tracked the sharp, defensive set of her shoulders. He reached out, picking up a stray slice of raw, cinnamon-coated apple from the cutting board. He put it in his mouth. The sharp, acidic crunch of the fruit cut through the dull ache of insomnia behind his eyes. "I kill people, Nora," Arthur said. The words dropped into the quiet kitchen like heavy stones. No euphemisms, no mobster slang. Just the ugly, naked truth. Nora's hands froze on the baking sheet. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the massive refrigerator. "I know," she said quietly. She didn't look at him. She shoved the baking sheet into the hot oven and slammed the door. "I grew up in a neighborhood where men like you owned the cops, the corners, and the grocery stores. I know exactly what you are. Does it disgust you?" "It terrifies me," she corrected, turning to face him, leaning her hips against the stove. She crossed her arms. "But hunger terrifies me more. So I cook." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. The flour dusting her faded black t-shirt, the burn scar on her wrist from the broiler. She was profoundly ordinary, yet completely unyielding. She didn't flinch from his reality. She didn't try to save him. She just fed him. The smell of the baking galette began to fill the room, the bourbon evaporating into hot sugar, the cinnamon turning sharp and woody, the butter browning in the pastry crust. It was a heavy, warm, messy smell. "Tell me how much he owes." Arthur repeated his voice, dropping into a low, commanding register. 50,000. Nora snapped the frustration finally boiling over. "Which means I'm here until June." "Happy." Arthur didn't blink. He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket, typed a brief message, and set it face down on the marble. "He doesn't owe 50,000 anymore," Arthur said. "The debt is cleared. The bookmaker holding it just suffered a sudden, permanent change in his business model." Nora stared at him. The air left her lungs. "What did you do?" "I bought your brother's life." Arthur's gaze was flat, completely devoid of warmth. "Which means you don't cook for the contract anymore, Nora. You cook for me, because you want to." Nora gripped the edge of the stove, her knuckles turning white. She should have been furious. She should have felt trapped. But beneath the shock, a dark, heavy relief settled into her bones. The crushing weight of the debt was gone. She turned around, grabbing a thick kitchen towel. She opened the oven. The galette was bubbling furiously, the dark brown sugar syrup bleeding over the edges and burning onto the pan. It smelled like charred sugar and alcohol. She pulled it out and dropped it on the stove. She grabbed a knife, cut a massive, messy slice, the hot filling collapsing onto the plate. She didn't bother with a fork. She slid the plate across the island. "It's going to burn your mouth," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Arthur picked up the slice with his bare hands. He didn't care about the heat. He took a bite. The burnt sugar cracked against his teeth, followed by the soft, tart fire of the bourbon-soaked apples. It was too sweet. It was too sharp. It was perfect. The explosion rattled the heavy crystal glasses in the dining room cabinets. It happened at 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nora was deep-frying chicken thighs in a massive cast-iron Dutch oven. The hiss and pop of the hot peanut oil drowned out the initial sound, but the violent shaking of the floorboards was unmistakable. Then came the shouting. The heavy kitchen doors flew open. Dominic burst in. His suit was torn at the shoulder, and his face was smeared with soot and something dark and wet. "Lock the doors!" Dominic roared at one of the guards trailing behind him. He turned to Nora, his eyes wild. "Clear the island. Now." Nora didn't ask questions. She grabbed the cutting boards, the bowls of seasoned flour, the knives, and swept them onto the floor with a chaotic crash. Two men hauled Arthur into the kitchen. He was unconscious. His head rolled back, his face a terrifying ash-grey color. His expensive wool overcoat was heavy and soaked black on the right side. The smell hit Nora before they even got him to the marble counter. It was a suffocating metallic wave. Iron pennies and wet earth, the scent of a slaughtered animal. It punched through the smell of the frying chicken, thick and cloying. They hoisted Arthur onto the pristine marble island. The blood immediately pooled stark and violent against the white stone. Carmine's guys. Dominic was hyperventilating his hands, pressing a balled-up suit jacket against Arthur's ribs. "A car bomb at the safe house. He took shrapnel. Doctor's 10 minutes out." Arthur groaned, his eyes fluttering open. The pain was secondary. The immediate violent reaction of his body was visceral. His pupils dilated. He smelled the blood, his own blood. The phantom scent that had starved him for weeks was suddenly real, coating his throat, filling his lungs. He violently turned his head to the side and retched dryly, his body convulsing against the marble. "Hold him still!" Dominic yelled, pressing harder on the wound. Arthur's eyes found Nora. They were panicked, wild. The grounded, terrifying boss was gone. He was drowning in the metallic stench. His lips moved, but only a wet gasp came out. Sick. Nora's mind went blank, and then the cold mechanical instincts of her upbringing kicked in. She didn't look at the blood. She looked at his face. She turned to the stove. The Dutch oven of peanut oil was still rolling, smoking slightly. Next to it was a small pot where she had been simmering leftover chicken bones and onion scraps for stock. She grabbed a thick ceramic mug. She plunged it into the simmering pot, coming up with a cloudy yellow broth. She didn't strain it. She grabbed the salt cellar and threw a heavy, aggressive handful of coarse sea salt into the hot liquid. She ground black pepper into it until the surface was black. She grabbed a bottle of cheap white vinegar from the counter and dumped a splash in. It wasn't food. It was a chemical intervention. Nora pushed past the guards. "Move!" She snapped at Dominic. "Are you crazy? He's bleeding out!" Dominic yelled. "He's going into shock, and he's going to choke on his own vomit!" Nora shouted back, wedging herself between Dominic and Arthur's head. She grabbed Arthur by the jaw. Her hands were covered in flour and grease, but her grip was like iron. She forced his head to turn toward her. "Arthur, look at me," she ordered. His eyes were rolling back. The smell of his own torn flesh was suffocating him. Nora brought the steaming mug to his lips. "Drink this. Swallow it. Now." She tipped the hot liquid into his mouth. Arthur choked, coughing weakly. The broth hit the back of his throat. It was violently salty. The vinegar burned his nasal passages like ammonia. The aggressive bite of the black pepper scoured his tongue. It was agonizing. It was sharp. It entirely obliterated the smell of the blood. The overpowering sensory shock of the hot, salty acid grounded him instantly. The nausea broke. His chest heaved, pulling in a massive, ragged breath of air. "Again!" Nora commanded, tipping the mug higher. Arthur swallowed the rest of it. The burning liquid settled in his stomach, a heavy, hot stone, anchoring him to his own body. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing from frantic gasps to ragged, painful pulls. "Doctor's here!" A guard yelled from the hallway. A man in a trench coat rushed in, dropping a black medical bag onto the bloody marble. He shoved Nora out of the way without looking at her. Nora stumbled back against the stove. She looked at the mug in her hand. It was smeared with Arthur's blood, where she had forced it against his mouth. She looked at the island. The pristine white marble was ruined. She turned off the burners. The kitchen was silent, except for the frantic clicking of the doctor's instruments and Dominic's heavy breathing. Arthur was biting down on a leather belt as the doctor dug into his side. But through the sweat and the agony, his eyes found Nora standing by the stove. He didn't look away. Even as they stitched him back together, he kept his eyes locked on her breathing, in the lingering smell of vinegar and hot oil that clung to her clothes. It was 2 days before Arthur walked again. The house had been a fortress of paranoid silence. Dominic had spent 48 hours eradicating Carmine's crew from the city. The violence was kept outside the walls, but the heavy, suffocating weight of it pressed against the windows. It was 5 a.m. The sky outside was the color of bruised iron. Nora was in the kitchen. She hadn't left the estate. She hadn't slept in a bed, opting for the small cot in the pantry. She felt dirty, exhausted, and hollowed out. She was standing at the sink, mechanically scrubbing the same cast-iron skillet for the 3rd time just to keep her hands moving. The soft squeak of rubber on tile made her pause. She turned off the faucet. Arthur was standing in the doorway. He was wearing loose pajama pants and a grey t-shirt. His right side was heavily bandaged, making his posture stiff and slightly hunched. He looked pale, gaunt, and completely drained. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He didn't say anything. He walked slowly, painfully toward the island. He didn't look at the spot where he had bled all over the marble. He looked at her. Nora dried her hands on a towel. She didn't ask how he felt. She didn't offer pity. Pity was useless in this room. "Sit," she said softly. Arthur sank onto the bar stool with a suppressed grimace. He leaned his left forearm on the counter, resting his forehead against his hand. He was shivering slightly, a residual effect of the blood loss and the painkillers. Nora turned to the stove. She didn't ask what he wanted. She knew what he needed. She grabbed a small saucepan. She poured in a cup of whole milk and a heavy splash of heavy cream. She dropped in a thick slice of salted butter. She turned the heat low, letting it simmer. She took a hunk of stale sourdough bread from the bread box. She tore it into rough, jagged pieces, dropping them directly into a deep bowl. When the milk mixture was steaming, bubbling slightly at the edges, she took it off the heat. She cracked a tremendous amount of black pepper into it, enough to make it look grey, and added a generous pinch of flaky sea salt. She poured the scalding peppery milk directly over the stale bread. It was milk toast. It was Depression-era food. It was what her grandmother made when someone was too sick to chew, but too hungry to sleep. It smelled intensely of warm dairy, sharp pepper, and yeast. She carried the bowl over and set it in front of Arthur. She handed him a spoon. Arthur lifted his head. He looked at the bowl. The bread was already softening, soaking up the rich, salted milk. It looked like mush. He picked up the spoon. His hand wasn't trembling this time. He took a bite. It was soft, yielding completely against his tongue. The rich, heavy fat of the butter and cream coated his throat, soothing the rawness left behind by the shouting and the vomit. The sharp bite of the black pepper cut through the richness, waking up his palate without overwhelming his fragile stomach. The salt grounded him. It tasted like safety. It tasted like a locked door. Arthur ate slowly, mechanically. The shivering stopped. The terrifying hollow feeling in his chest began to recede, replaced by the heavy, warm weight of the soaked bread. Nora stood on the opposite side of the island. She watched him eat. The adrenaline that had kept her going for 2 days finally crashed, leaving her utterly exhausted. She leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping. Dominic handled Carmine, Arthur said quietly, his voice raspy. He didn't look up from the bowl. I figured, Nora replied flatly. He's dead. His lieutenants are dead. It's over. Nora crossed her arms. Until the next one. Arthur finally looked up. His dark eyes met hers. There were no illusions between them now. The fancy suits, the pristine marble, the expensive cars, it was all window dressing for a slaughterhouse, and they both knew it. Until the next one, Arthur agreed. He took another bite. He scraped the bottom of the bowl. When he was finished, he pushed the empty bowl aside. He didn't get up. He just sat there, looking at the empty kitchen, the heavy silence settling around them, not like a tomb, but like a blanket. He looked at Nora. She had bags under her eyes. Her hair was a mess. She smelled like old frying oil and bleach. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, purely because she was real. You didn't go home, Arthur noted. I have a job, Nora said, her chin lifting in that stubborn, defensive way he had come to rely on. Arthur reached across the marble. He didn't grab her hand. He just rested his fingers near hers. His skin was warm. You're not a maid anymore, Nora. I know, she said quietly. She looked down at his hand, tracing the scarred knuckles with her eyes. She didn't pull away. She wasn't a maid. She wasn't a chef. She was the anchor holding a monster to the earth. She fed the wolf, and in return, the wolf belonged to her. What do you want for dinner? Nora asked, her voice steady. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. The phantom scent of blood was completely gone, replaced entirely by the smell of warm milk, black pepper, and her. Whatever you make, Arthur said. Just burn the garlic.